as you walk into the dungeon, you look up and you see it, this monster, and you recognize it as something that has been inside of you for so long, this fear that you've always had. It's time to face it. Hi there, and welcome to Psychology at the Table. This is our continuing series at GameholeCon, and I am lucky enough today to be sitting next to a couple of monster creators for Kobold Press, Dillon and Meagan Maricle. Thank you so much for being here.
Of course, thank you for having us.
Yeah, thanks for having us.
So one of the things reasons I wanted to have you guys on is something I do with some of my players and definitely some of my clients that I see therapeutically is to talk about turning your own internal demons and things into monsters and to give them stats and to understand your own stuff better by actually making it into something. Is that something that you guys have ever considered when making a monster or like done anything like that before, or is that...
So I would say that I've never used any of my own fears to create a monster, at least not for D&D. I've tinkered around with it in some other systems, some things that were bothering me or bugging me. I've kind of created an effigy of them and tried to kind of create a way for me to look at it from the outside to see how it might affect people in sort of an abstract sense.
Yeah.
I haven't really gone that route with D&D currently, but I do think of things like fear and anxiety, not necessarily my own though.
Yeah, I mean, I don't do a lot of creation, I do a lot of editing, but as far as what I've seen is a lot of that usually comes from folklore monsters, because folklore usually originates from some fear or some anxiety or something in the culture that is upsetting the culture or something like that. And we have a handful of creatures in our creature codex that are based on folklore fears.
Right.
Oh, cool.
Like I know the fear Liath, I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing that correctly. I just have to edit it. I don't have to speak it. So
don't worry, I won't judge you for pronunciations. I can handle everything.
But it has an unwatchable trait, and it has this whole thing of if you can't see it, it can get closer to you.
Yeah.
But if you turn and look at it, it disappears.
Almost
awesome.
a little like the Weeping Angels in Doctor Who.
Exactly. So we have a handful of creatures that are like that are kind of built off these fears and anxieties of ancient peoples, and we've kind of brought those folklore into the more modern edition. Right.
Oh, very cool. When thinking about like creating monsters and like trying to get a certain feel for it, so like if you're trying to create fear or create that like anxiety and that unknown, like what are some like mechanics or some things that you consider to kind of help build that feeling into that monster?
So when I start building a monster, I usually start, I'm very visual, so I start with kind of an image, like maybe a splash page out of a comic book or a freeze frame of a movie scene, and I try to think of what is being evoked in that, and then I try to build traits and mechanics and abilities and actions that will push in that direction. So if I were looking for a fear of, I don't know, water, I would think about the drowning mechanics, how it works to make someone hold their breath, that sort of thing. Just think of the things that exist that go along with a specific type of fear. Don't just jump straight to the frightened condition, because that's easy, but it's also a little boring.
Yeah.
So you have to find some way to shake it up and maybe come at it kind of from the side a little bit.
Oh yeah. Well, and that's you can have the players frightened, right? But monsters, just in their description, the way they look, how they move, that in and of itself can actually put fears in the players rather than just the characters.
Imagery is great for that. Just use all the senses: sounds, smells, squelching noises, rotting meat, all that great stuff.
Yeah. Well, I think with that imagery, you guys did something great in Creature Codex. In my household, it's been called the Nope, which is the giant long legs.
Oh, yes. Goliath long legs.
Yes, it's a spider. How big is it? It's
gargantuan.
It's gargantuan,
gargantuan spider. So it's been called the Nope in my house.
The giant Nope.
Yeah.
Yeah, its legs look like tree trunks, so you think you're in a forest and you're underneath a spider.
Yep.
Yeah. That's terrifying.
Yep. It is a little.
So when we're talking about like you mentioned the fear condition, and that's kind of a good segue into this, because like when I'm thinking about like I made a depression monster with somebody, and we made a condition, we called it the disheartened condition. So like making a new condition, so something, I guess you would use like the fear condition would be the most logical thing to kind of base it off of, but like what are things to consider maybe when you're trying to make sure it's balanced and it makes sense?
Well, for conditions, instead of creating a whole new condition, I actually would treat it mechanically more like a disease.
Oh, that's a really good idea.
So with diseases, you have something that affects you immediately, and then after a long rest or a short rest, an additional effect happens, and you get to make your saving throw again. So then it kind of shows this is a long-term thing that continues to happen, or that can continue to happen, without it having to try and how are we going to fit it in with all of the other conditions that exist and not break the game? So for balance, I'd actually treat it more like a disease if you're trying to create something new. So it wouldn't actually be a disease, right? But mechanically, you could work it similarly as something that comes up again and again regularly.
That's kind of a cool way to kind of play it with a slow burn.
Yeah.
Now, I have made a condition it wasn't for a monster, but it was in the Midgard World Book for the Shadow Realm. It's a condition called Despondent. And I was inspired by the Never-Ending Story with the Swamp of Sadness. And sorry, everybody, for bringing that up. I know I'm terrible. But so I made this quicksand that basically sapped your will and your drive that you could do anything about it. And so it gave you disadvantage on various ability checks and made it more difficult for you to influence other people. Not every ability check, but very specific ones that being hopeless would sort of weigh down on you about. And so as long as you're in this quicksand, it's harder and harder to get out because you just don't bother to try.
And say again, where can people find that one?
That's in the Midgard World Book.
Okay, good.
In the it's discussed in the Shadow Realm chapter.
Awesome. So, it's cool. Now, I think when we're trying to create something that we're maybe struggling with or just trying to create a monster, it's really easy to think about strengths. Like, okay, this is what it's good at, but I think you have to have those vulnerabilities and those weaknesses. So what are some ways to build in weaknesses or to think about that more?
So the way I like to look at it is, what is their strength? Because oftentimes that can be their weakness. You know, so at the most basic, like an underwater creature requires it to be underwater. Right. So its weakness would then be being out of the water, right? So it's like the most, I guess, basic way you can look at that. But there are other things that, I did have an example written down. And then, let's see. Right. Oh, yes. Creatures that can frighten you often can also be frightened themselves. So then their strength is their fear, right? But then that fear could also be something that keeps them safe because of their own fears.
Yeah.
Right. So a lot of times this strength can end up being turned on their heads and end up becoming the weakness because strengths often end up being the wall that the creature puts up. Kind of thing.
There are simple ways, like the most simple way to do it when you think of vulnerability is a damage vulnerability. You can have a specific thing that the creature just takes double damage from, because like maybe a creature of darkness, for someone who's afraid of the dark, light can harm it, so radiant damage might be more effective against it. It could either be because it's vulnerable, so it takes double damage, or it could be maybe the one damage type it's not immune to, so nothing else can hurt it except this. And then you can play with things, like you said, it can be frightened. Like maybe there's a special way to frighten a creature that if you deal a certain type of damage to it or use a certain type of material or show it, as long as it sees that, it can't approach. Or as long as you do this certain thing that sort of works against the fear that it inspires, it's frightened itself.
So 2 follow-ups to that. So your first one with the shadow creature that's vulnerable to radiant, that can end up being a creature that maybe it has an ability that allows it to snuff out light that's near it, but then radiant damage, which is light damage, essentially then hurts it. So that would be its strength and its weakness working against it. As far as the specific object thing, we actually have the Nian, which is based on Chinese folklore. I believe it's like the New Year creature. It's like this lion creature that kind of brings in the new year. But in the old folklore, it was this monster, and the reason why red is associated with the new year is because the creature was afraid of red. And it's also afraid of loud noises, so fireworks were associated with the new year. You know, so you've got things like that drive it away, and so the creature has these built-in, it's this really scary, crazy monster, but then it's got these little built-in things of, it's afraid of fire, and it's afraid of loud noises. So if the player like bangs his sword on his shield, it creates a loud noise, and that particular creature for that round has disadvantage on their abilities.
Nice.
Oh, that's cool.
Back in the second edition Ravenloft, there was kind of a boxed campaign called Death Ascendant. I don't remember the exact name of it, but it had several parts. At the end, you end up fighting essentially death, and there's almost no way to hurt it. It's just it is death to go up against this thing, but it is driven away and made powerless by symbols of life, and one of those is things like newborns. So in one case, you can find these baby were-tigers, were-tiger cubs, and if you hold them up, it flees because they're symbols of new life, or like a baby blanket, that sort of thing that would drive the creature away.
Oh, that's cool. It's really neat. Any resources that you would recommend to people wanting to learn more about making monsters or making their own kind of creations?
Podcasts is the first thing that jumps to my mind. We've done several talks, and a lot of other great monster designers have been on several. What are a couple of them?
I did. I know I did one recently on Tabletop Babble with James Introcaso. I don't know if he's posted it yet.
Okay.
But I recorded it about a week or two ago, so it might be another week or two before he gets it out. But we did one. It was Chris Harris and I both worked with James on that one, and we talked a lot about monster creation. We had our monster making panel yesterday here, so for people that were here, they can listen to it.
Go back in time, come back to the Game Hall Con, and go to their monster making panel.
Maybe somebody recorded it. We'll see.
Oh, and then as far as right. That was the other one I wanted to mention when you asked this question earlier, was the Mordenkainen's. So Mordenkainen's book or Tome of Foes has a lot about demons and devils. And demons and devils are some of our original fears made into monsters.
Yeah.
Right? Like a lot of the demons, especially like the big like blob monsters that have like faces that melt and things like that. Like a lot of that were our original fears turned into monsters, back way in the day, and they've kind of brought it all back into Mordenkainen, so that's a good kind of template. Like demons and devils are a very good template to kind of pull from for these kind of nightmarish creatures.
Most definitely.
So Tabletop Babble with James Introcaso is an amazing resource. There have been several monster design talks on there. I did some way back with Sean Merwin and James Hake when we were originally working on the Creature Codex, and even back to Tome of Beasts. I did a talk with I think it was Will Jones of Encounter Roleplay on his Twitch channel. So that should be archived there. You can check out Encounter Roleplay, and they'll have the VOD. They should. Nice. Where we did some monster talks.
I'll try to put links to these in the doobly-doo.
Sure. So. Let's see, Tabletop Babble on the. Sorry, we already said that. On the Tome Show, there was a segment called the Roundtable that also was run by James Introcaso. There were several monster talks on there as well.
Awesome.
Yep.
Thank you, but before we close out, any final thoughts? Are there suggestions that you would have for people?
Well, for basic monster design, I always love pointing people to, it's the Creature Codex, so it's a shameless plug, right? But there's a creature, right? There's a creature in it called the Zen Absorber. It's it looks like Xena Absorber. But the base creature is all about pulling traits from other creatures and actions from other creatures. It like absorbs things around it.
Cool.
And its body changes based on what's near it. And that's to me is a really good like monster making 101. Like the most basic level of monster creation is that creature. Just the rules of how to add traits and add actions and stuff to the creature kind of show the basic steps for creating a creature. So that's a really good, just like really baseline if you need like a small template to work with.
Yeah, that's a good one. Tips as far as monster creating go, make sure you start with and build from the story of the monster. Don't necessarily focus on it has a 30 strength or anything like that. But if you have an idea of what you want to do, like this is going to swallow you whole, you can start with that and then build around it. Think about what it is you want the monster's story to be, why does it do the things that it does, build on that, and that's going to make your monster so much more interesting.
Yeah.
Like, what does it eat? What eats it?
Yeah, why does it swallow things whole?
Right.
That sort of deal.
What's the reason for that? Yeah. Why did it develop that way?
Exactly, yep.
That's awesome. Thank you guys so much for coming on and chatting about this.
Thank you very much for having us. This is great.
No, this is awesome. And anybody out there, check out the Creature Codex and Tome of Beasts.
Please do.
Oh my gosh, so many wonderful monsters in there.
Thank you very much.
Yes. All right. Well, I hope this was helpful to you guys. If you have other questions or comments, please leave them below. And as always, let's make space at the table for everyone.